everyone. Lisa Wood here from Energy Change Makers. Thanks so much for joining us for an online site. And we are devoted to creating community and content for those who are working on the grid edge. I'm really happy to say we have with us today Ari Pesco, and Ari is the director of the Electricity Law Initiative at Harvard's Environmental and Energy Center. And we have with us Eliza Martin, who is a legal fellow at the center. Together, they recently published a very interesting and timely paper called Extracting Profits from the Public: How Utility Ratepayers Are Paying for Big Tech's Power. This topic, issues surrounding AI and data centers, we were talking about them before we started here. They're just huge issues right now for anybody who's in energy or distributed energy. And that's for a lot of reasons. If you're working on the grid edge, we're seeing more and more data centers that are choosing on-site power. We just wrote about a 5 gigawatt data center project in Texas that's going to be powered solely by on-site renewable energy, including eventually green hydrogen. And then another reason I think this is of particularly interest to DR companies and those working in this field is that, we always pay close attention to utility rates because it's that pricing that DERs often leverage against. And then finally, most of us here are all utility ratepayers, and we'd really like to know what this data center boom will cost us. So I am going to turn this over now to Ari and Eliza. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks so much for the invitation and for your interest in our work. I am going to do my best to see if I can share this presentation with everyone. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background on utilities and utility regulation. I know there's some real experts here on that topic, so I'll try to get through it efficiently, and then I'll pass it on to Eliza to talk about some of the specific findings in our paper about the mechanisms by which the public may be paying for big techs. So this is the paper we released last month, and let me just dive into it here. For 100 years or so, since the electric utility industry got started, until around the mid-90s or so, there's a nice correlation between economic growth and electricity use. That correlation stopped then, and then shortly thereafter, by the mid-late 2000s, electricity demand had really sort of leveled off, at least on a national level. And in the past few years, we've seen growth return. That itself has been a big story and has got a lot of coverage and analysis. And in many parts of the country, electricity growth and projections about near-term future growth is being driven by data centers. It's certainly not the only cause of growth, but it is the largest reason for some of the projections that we're showing here on the screen, these utility-specific projections. And these data centers, I think, are somewhat unique facilities in the energy intensity. These data centers are basically warehouses filled with power-hungry computer chips and cooling equipment. And it was not unusual a couple years ago to see reports of data centers being developed in the hundreds of megawatts. So just to put some scale on this, the city of Cleveland has a peak load of about 300 megawatts. So you're basically condensing the city of Cleveland's energy consumption into basically a single warehouse. We're now seeing in the past several months gigawatt scale data centers. So again, put this in comparison, I like using cities as points of comparison. The peak load of the city of New Orleans is a little over a gigawatt. And so we're seeing in Northeast Louisiana the data center development that is larger than the entire city of New Orleans from an energy footprint. So really extraordinary growth in many parts of the country. And to explain how this trickles down to all of us, I'm just going to give a brief overview of utility regulation, how regulators set rates, and why they do it the way they do it. The key word here is socialization. Utility rate regulation socializes the costs of operating and expanding the utilities system across the public. It's basically a two-step process. First, we figure out how much money does the utility need to operate and expand its system. That's step one. Step two is once we have that total amount, how do we then divvy it up among the various types of ratepayers, such as residential, commercial, and industrial. And the basic logic here, this is a business model that was developed more than 100 years ago when the electricity industry was in its very earliest phases, and it was clearly in the public interest to facilitate its expansion, expand access to electricity. And so this business model was designed to just facilitate growth for the benefit of society. The basic principle driving the second step of that process, figuring out sort of who pays how much of the sort of total amount of energy that the utility is trying to collect, is cost causation. The idea is that ratepayers should pay an amount that relates to the utility's costs to provide service to that type of consumer. And different types of consumers have different costs of service. There's different infrastructure needs, for example, for residential consumers as compared to a very large factory and industrial user. They also have different energy consumption patterns. And so there's some reasonable basis for setting distinct rates for different types of consumers, but this is not a physics problem. There's no one right answer to say how much should a particular type of consumer pay for electricity. The methodologies used are sort of driven by the particular interests of that consumer. So in a utility rate case, we have different constituencies that go and provide evidence to utility regulators about what sort of rate they should pay. And they're all being driven by self-interest. Residential ratepayers want low rates for them. Industrial consumers want low rates for them. And it's up to the regulator to basically weigh all the evidence and try to use their best judgment while also kind of trying to meet their own particular policy goals as to who should pay how much for electricity. So this is the basic process. We socialize, we then allocate the costs among various types of ratepayers. So the easiest way for this sort of cost shift to happen for how data center energy costs can sort of trickle into other ratepayers' bills is just through this classic process. We have these new giant energy consuming warehouses coming to utility service territory. The utility says, well, in order to hook you up to the system, we have to build hundreds of millions of dollars of new infrastructure, and we're just going to use the traditional socialization process to spread the costs across everyone. That socialization kind of made sense when it was sort of incremental increases in energy demand were happening around the utility system. There was a basis for saying that this sort of growth was generally beneficial for society. It was allowing for economic development, population growth, the other sort of standard metrics we use to measure societal progress. And so it made sense to spread these costs as sort of a simplifying way to enable the utilities' growth. But our premise in this paper is that that process just doesn't make a whole lot of sense where growth is being driven by very intensive energy use of just a few identifiable customers who happen to be some of the wealthiest corporations in the world. And we're also very concerned in the paper, though this was not our focus. So we did not try to sort of go through and kind of comprehensively identify all the utilities that are sort of just using their normal processes to spread the costs of data center infrastructure. What we were focused on in the paper is more subtle mechanisms more subtle rate-making mechanisms or other processes outside of normal rate cases that utilities might be using to spread data center energy costs across society. And our concern is that utilities have incentives to try and shift these costs because utilities make money by building infrastructure. And as rate-regulated monopolies, they have this sort of unique ability to exploit their monopolies and to participate in competitive markets like attracting data centers, which is now this sort of national competition to get this business, and to potentially offer good deals to those customers in a competitive market and use the complexities and the subjectivity of a rate-making process to sort of force other ratepayers to subsidize the costs of these discounts. So now, Eliza, is going to walk through some kind of the specific issues we talk about in the paper.
Thanks, Ari. So we identify in the paper that one of the ways that utilities are socializing their expansion costs is through secret contracts that are deals between data center companies and utilities. So because utility shareholders profit from growth, these utility companies, like Ari said, are incentivized to offer data center companies special deals and special rates to attract this data center business. When the special rate that a utility offers a data center company is lower than the utility's cost to serve that data center, the utility can then try to use its monopoly power to force other ratepayers to shoulder that subsidy that the utility has offered its data center customer. So we know that utilities have an incentive and an intent to shift costs because there's a history of them doing this. In the paper, we highlight one example, but recent federal antitrust litigation against Duke Energy, which is, as I'm sure everyone knows, one of the largest utilities in the country and the dominant utility in the Carolinas. And that antitrust litigation during the course of discovery revealed that Duke was acting on its incentive to shift costs of a special contract to its other ratepayers. So the context for all of this was that Duke was facing competition from a new power plant developer that offered a more competitive deal to supply power to a small nonprofit utility. This nonprofit utility had historically been a customer of Duke's, but they were prepared to sign a new contract for a better rate. But right before they signed that contract, Duke offered its customer a deal that amounted to a $325 million discount. And these internal company documents that were only disclosed because of this litigation revealed that Duke planned to shift the cost of this discount to its other ratepayers by just raising their rates. So our research that we did revealed that utilities are using these sort of special contract mechanisms to serve data center customers. And this just makes us concerned that utilities are taking advantage of their monopoly power to force the rest of us into subsidizing their competitive line of business. So in many states, as y'all probably know, regulators have to approve utility special contracts, but it's difficult for regulators to reject these deals for a number of different reasons, but I just want to highlight two. So first, these contracts are almost always confidential. So the utility makes a claim that this is proprietary pricing information, and they can't reveal the terms of this contract. This makes it really difficult for parties to rebut the utility's claim that it isn't shifting costs. Unlike in a rate case where the adversarial process, generates all this evidence that allows regulators to interrogate the utility's claims, a special contract proceeding has few, if any, non-contract parties to challenge the utility's claims that it isn't shifting costs. And because regulators, are supposed to be making their decisions based on what's in the record, it can be really difficult for regulators to understand the extent of the cost shifting and then reject a bad deal. I also just want to highlight that regulators face a lot of political pressure to approve these contracts. If a governor's, already announced that there's a huge multi-billion-dollar, data center deal that's coming to their state, it takes a lot of guts for regulators to then reject the special contract deal on the back end. And, realistically, it can hurt a regulator's chance at being reappointed or reelected to a state PUC. So they have their own incentives there. So Ari and I just want to highlight a particularly egregious example of how a utility is shifting costs for a data center. You can see on your screen, this is a proposed data center for Meta, the parent company of Facebook, in Louisiana. So Meta and Entergy Louisiana, which is the utility there, apparently they've signed a contract for Entergy to provide electricity for this data center in Northeast Louisiana. Entergy has said that regulators do not need to approve the contract, and because of this, we didn't know anything about the deal until Entergy had to request Louisiana Public Service Commission approval to build $3 billion of gas power generation and transmission resources for the Meta data center. We still don't know basically anything about the deal, so there's not information really about the size of the facility or whether or not the public would be on the hook for this $3 billion that Entergy is proposing to develop to serve Meta's data center. because we can't see the contract, it's not clear if Meta is covering this $3 billion in infrastructure costs, or if these are going to be socialized through a rate case and just put in the rate base. Again, because no one can see the contract, it's also not clear to us what would happen if Entergy started developing all of this infrastructure for Meta, and then the market fundamentals changed, Meta decides to withdraw from the project, or says that there's a new computing chip and we actually need less power than we had been planning. So this is a really egregious example of sort of this issue around special contracts and the intersection with rates, but our research uncovered a lot of these contracts between data centers and utilities. So the next mechanism that Ari and I talk about in the paper as a way to shift data center costs is because of these separate federal and state processes for allocating interstate transmission and power market costs. So interstate power sales and transmission development are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory, by FERC, which determines how these costs are shared among utilities. After these costs have been allocated at FERC, state PUCs then apply their own formula for dividing these FERC-approved costs among the utilities' ratepayers. So this can result really in residential ratepayers having to pay a large portion of these costs that are tied to data center development. So just to give one example here, in 2023, PJM, which is this utility alliance in the Mid-Atlantic region, Midwest area, approved $5.1 billion of new interstate transmission projects that were designed in a large part to accommodate new data centers. Dominion, which is the utility in Virginia, was allocated $2.5 billion of this cost, just about that, and Maryland utilities were allocated $551 million. So after FERC allocated those costs, the respective state public utility commissions applied their own formulas to allocate those costs among the different utility ratepayers. So in both the states, as you can see on your screen, residential ratepayers have ended up bearing the majority of those costs. So the final way that we talk about shifting costs is through co-location. There's a lot of different configurations of these co-location arrangements, but just at a very high generalized level, in a co-location arrangement, a data center basically connects to an existing power plant, and all of its energy needs are met by the power plant. So you can see on your screen the Talon Energy, there's a nuclear plant, and at the bottom, the kind of white building is a data center complex. So when these co-location arrangements happen, the power plant stops supplying energy to utilities through the competitive interstate markets. There's a few different cost shifting issues with co-location around transmission costs, but generally co-location risks driving up prices in interstate power markets because entire swaths of existing generation resources are removed from the competitive market and replaced with usually dirtier and more costly forms of generation of power plants. So just to take a step back from these three different mechanisms that we talk about, I want to just talk briefly about the consequences of these data center costs. So the first consequence, which we've been talking about, is that electricity costs are going to go up for consumers. The second consequence is that big tech companies can amplify utility political power. Utilities are some of the most politically powerful bodies in the US, particularly in the southeast region of the country. And if utilities and big tech companies are aligned, they can exert a significant and disproportionate amount of political power on state regulators and legislators. And then the final thing I just want to highlight is that utilities will also likely delay opportunities to initiate power sector reforms. So there's obviously a long history of utilities trying to delay much needed and proven reforms. So, there's been discussion around trying to improve the regional transmission planning process. That process took FERC nearly 5 years, and that is currently tied up in litigation, which is just one example of this. But we know that there are proven technologies and approaches to expanding our existing, power infrastructure that can benefit the public. But these, technologies and system planning processes may not be as profitable for utility companies. So data centers really just provide utilities with this like shiny new opportunity to keep doing the same thing it's always done, which is to earn a bunch of money from developing more of the same infrastructure that it's always developed. So we have a couple of recommendations that we think could help address some of the consequences that Ari and I, have been talking about here and also in the paper. We just want to say that none of these are really foolproof ways of protecting consumers, but these can help with some of the consequences. So the first thing is we recommend that states just stop allowing utility companies to offer these special contract deals. Require a utility to offer standardized contracts for large energy consumers and include uniform charges in terms of service. This can just help with some of these transparency issues that we talked about earlier. It doesn't necessarily solve this, socialization problem that Ari talks about, which happens through rate cases, but it does address these transparency problems, which is that no one knows what's happening in these proceedings. No one knows the scale of this development or this subsidization. So tariffs are a movement towards tariffs and away from these special contract deals is one of our recommendations. The next recommendation comes from a research paper out of Duke University, which was written by Tyler Norris and folks there. They suggest that data centers should be required to commit to flexible operations. So this could allow regulators to order a data center to shut off for just a few hours a day when there's peak demand, so on the hottest and the coldest days of the year. And this can help avoid or defer some of the really expensive build out that we would need to make to serve these data centers. We also recommend amending state law to require retail competition. Obviously, this is much more difficult because utilities have an incentive to protect their monopoly and their profits. But to protect ratepayers, states could require new data center companies to procure power through competitive processes rather than confining them to utility supplied power. Or states could go further and allow or require new data centers to isolate themselves entirely from the utility-owned network by creating these energy parks. So an energy park would allow a data center customer to install on-site generation that would be sufficient for powering the data center. So the data center and the generation would be completely disconnected from the utility-owned network, which would just prevent this cost shifting that we see happening whenever the utility enters the equation. This is, again, just more difficult to implement because it would require amending state law, and utilities would almost certainly lobby aggressively against any change to their monopoly. And the final recommendation we have is just that we recommend that utilities disclose information about their data center forecast and load requests. Data center companies want electricity and they want it quickly. So many companies are requesting service from multiple utilities. And this just makes planning generally difficult under any circumstance, but especially with these huge load requests that we're seeing. And none of these are foolproof ways for protecting consumers, but these are